I'm pretty sure that we have a lot to learn from Norfolk. It's been pretty impressive to see their story as well as many of the others that have been expressed today. And it's actually pretty intimidating because no matter how much I think we've made in the way of progress, there's obviously some really phenomenal work that's taking place across the country. And so we have in Southeast Florida been very eager not only to advance our own efforts regionally, but also to reach out and try and enhance some of those cooperatives, those collaboratives where we can share more information and jointly accelerate our respective planning efforts and hopefully bring more resources to these issues as we've seen that there is a great need. I didn't have a great deal of time to put my thoughts together as eloquent as a way of I would have liked, but what I have done with the presentation today is really sought to just provide an overview as to the Southeast Florida circumstance, how we came to work together as a region, what our process has looked like, and where we're going from here. I'm sure that there are many key points that I would like to express in the story that I probably won't have a chance to recollect in our short time together today, but I hope there will be opportunities for follow-up outside of this. But really a great symposium, and I certainly congratulate Bill on putting that together. As a bit of introduction to Southeast Florida, I think most folks here know where Florida well sits, but the four counties that I'm going to be referring to today are Palm Beach County, Broward County, Miami-Dade County, and Monroe. Jointly, we have a population of about 5.8 million residents. Approximately a third of the state population. We're a highly developed coastal community. We spoke about built-out communities. Broward County is entirely built out. There's nowhere else to grow. We're sandwiched between the Everglades to the west and our coastal Atlantic to the east. Miami-Dade has quite a bit more in the way of rural agricultural area. Monroe County is very much constrained by their Keys circumstance. So in many regards, we don't have much in the way of exit except to the north to where all of you sit. And we're all contending with pretty significant growth demands in our near futures, and I think a lot of this could certainly be exacerbated by what happens with regards to climate pressures. I know in Southeast Florida we've seen unpredictable rates in growth as a result of major storms. Well, I think some of the climate impacts that we are collectively realizing also has the influence to dramatically influence some of the population projections that we use in our planning decisions. Like Virginia, we are also very flat, low-lying, very subject to increases in sea level, tidal surges. We do not have an easy mechanism for removing water from our landscape except through a very intricate and extensive network of canals, which I'll talk about in a little bit further along. And we also lack areas for long-term water storage, so it makes it, one, difficult to manage large volumes of water that we anticipate with increased storm events and climate change. But when we're dealing with periods of drought, we also lack an area to store that same water to help mitigate for some of the water shortages that really do plague our area, despite our average of 58 inches of rainfall a year. And we also have a number of natural resources that are not only of importance to our local economies, but also our national treasures, including the Everglades, Florida Bay, our coastal reef systems that are the basis for very important fisheries as well as recreational and economic opportunities. Within our region, we have 108 cities, 3 major international airports, more if you count some of the smaller airports in our region as well, 2 major seaports located within Broward and Miami-Dade. These are major cargo ports, cruise ports. A lot of our petroleum product ends up coming in through this portion of our country. Military bases in Monroe County and in South Dade, and as our population accounts for about a third of the state, we also produce about 1/3 of the state's gross domestic product. So it really is important not only to our communities what happens in Southeast Florida with respect to resilience and our ability to help insulate from extreme economic losses associated with climate impacts, but it's in the state's interest, and I think in the national interest too, when you think about how much of our total domestic product is generated in our coastal communities. The entire nation, of course, has a great deal invested in terms of being able to be assured of the long-term economic viability of our coastal cities and counties. And we are substantially growing. Many of you are probably familiar with some of these very significant public investment works projects that are taking place in both Broward and Miami-Dade counties, major expansions to our ports in preparation for the larger ships, and we have also the major investments in our transportation networks, and some of these are being undertaken today through significant public-private partnerships as a mechanism for investment. This is an area in which we're anticipating a lot more in the way of a strategy for trying to advance many of our water supply projects as well as coastal resilience, because the numbers shared today, $1 billion as part of a resilient strategy. We've got existing water supply projects that in a county alone are estimated at about $1 billion just in Broward County in order to meet some of the legislative requirements that have come down through the state process in the last couple of years. So what are some of the things that make Southeast Florida particularly vulnerable? Like many of our communities are substantially aware of the threat of sea level rise from the coast, but in Florida we also have the difficulty of trying to mitigate for sea level rise impacts that will come up from the south and in behind us. So when we think about the Everglades, and let's see, is there a pointer on here? I'm not sure. So, well, I'm trying. In any event, water will be able to move up through the southern part of the tip of Florida and actually cause flooding on the backside of our county and the inland portions of our communities, as well as are having to contemplate the impacts of sea level rise in the coastal areas. In addition, we do have extremely dense coastal development. I'll show you some of those numbers in a bit in terms of the estimates of the real estate that's at risk. We have an extremely transmissive aquifer. So I think a number of individuals here have probably heard about how Southeast Florida is different, but we don't sit on granite, we don't sit on basalt, we sit on limestone. And so while we may be able to construct a large 8-foot wall to head off sea level rise, the water continues to move underneath our feet, up above, and rise to encounter the surface several blocks and even miles inland are some of the predictions. So we're in the midst of going through some very advanced hydrologic modeling in order to ascertain just how much does the porosity of our aquifer influence the extent to which we can be successful long-term in our adaptation strategies. And again, like Norfolk, where water is this great asset, that's true for Southeast Florida, but it substantially shapes our community, but it also creates one of the greater hazards for us as we look to the future. And some of the examples are shown here. The vulnerabilities we have include storm-related flooding, with more intense rainfall events, as well as storm events with high wind. We'll experience greater beach erosion, which is a problem today, severe wind and damage. In our coastal environments, we know that even with small increases in wind speed, you see exponential increases in economic losses. Water shortages, we already have about 20% of our coastal well fields that are vulnerable to saltwater intrusion. This is our highest quality water. It's also where we require the least amount of treatment, so the loss of these well fields is very significant as we have to move to new treatment infrastructure, and of course that's more energy intensive and counters many of the mitigation strategies that are also part of our long-term planning efforts. And then there's a number of questions with regards to how sea level rise impacts will affect Everglades restoration, which is, of course, the basis of a $12 billion restoration plan. But Everglades restoration, in the end, ends up being one of the more significant ways whereby we can protect our water supply, because it's about recharging and holding more water within the natural system. And we oftentimes talk about fighting water with water. This is what creates the freshwater head that pushes the salt water back. And then the preservation of our coral reefs are a major mechanism for mitigating for wave energy and beach erosion. But with climate change, we know that the changes in ocean acidification end up also creating yet another strain on the reef system. And so there's all kinds of questions about what our environment's going to look like as we move forward. But these aren't questions that are specific to Broward County. We're all addressing these along the coast, and as a result, many of the counties had already begun to develop climate change task forces, begun to work on sea level rise projections, begun to address vulnerability maps and analyses, but none of this was being coordinated, so we had extensive teams of staff and resources and energy that was being invested on a county-by-county basis while we're only within 30 to 40 miles of each of our neighboring counties. And this really only became most evident when our elected leaders and some of our staff were up in Washington, D.C. when we were anticipating a big energy bill and wanting to make sure that climate issues didn't get lost in that conversation. And as a result of the dialogue that was happening in D.C. and the conversations with the congressional leaders, it became clear that we needed to better organize, come forward with more consistent planning tools, and recognize that we had a lot more in common than what was being depicted in our sharing of our efforts at that point in time. And so there was an agreement that we would come back to Southeast Florida, convene a regional climate leadership summit, bring together all of our elected officials from across the region to have this conversation about climate change. What does it mean to our region? How can we better coordinate, and where are the regional activities that could be undertaken that would accelerate our planning processes and also be much more efficient, and where could we take advantage of shared resources? So we held the first summit back in 2009. I think it was well attended. We had a great deal of energy that came to the conversation, but what was most significant was the key deliverable from that summit, and that was the unveiling of the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact. And this compact was a voluntary agreement among the 4 counties of Southeast Florida, a bipartisan document with bipartisan leadership across the 4 counties to collaborate in climate mitigation and adaptation planning on the regional scale. It committed us to a number of different things, including to work collaboratively on climate and energy policy at the state and federal levels, to cooperate in the development in unified planning tools, including a unified sea level rise projection that we would then utilize for all of our planning activities, in the development of a methodology for mapping vulnerabilities and quantifying and making assessments about the losses, and also on greenhouse gas emissions to develop a regional baseline and then begin to prioritize our investments in mitigation based upon the relative contributions to that baseline throughout the 4-county area. It also committed us to work collaboratively on the development of a regional climate action plan and assigning staff to that exercise, and then reconvening on an annual basis with our elected leadership and as a region in order to assess our progress and determine some of the next steps based upon where there were emerging opportunities. And where we went from there is the development of a staff steering committee that has overseen this effort, and I would acknowledge that this has been done without any external staff. This was during the period of the most significant budgetary reductions that were happening within local government, so we didn't have any grants that were available at this time or new staff resources, but we did it with our existing staff. We developed a coordination process where we were meeting monthly. We developed sub-teams that were focused on the areas of policy and legislative process. This would guide our development of a regional legislative program each year at the state and federal level. We developed a team that would be more focused on the technical aspects of working through the development of the unified planning tools, and then we developed a planning team for the summit processes, and basically this structure has continued to exist through the last several years. We're now in our 5th year, just as a sense of how long we've been working together. And then we've recognized too that the planning team itself that consisted of the staff steering committee would continue to move information up through our respective agencies, through our administrators, and through our elected officials and boards as that time became appropriate. But what I want to acknowledge in this process is that it wasn't a new governance structure, actually. It was a collaborative process with no new resources, and we all acknowledge